Welcome to Man in Progress, Forging Manhood. I'm Travis Murray, values coach and your guide to building a life driven by real values. Each week we explore what it means to be a man today, talk about and to thinkers and doers who've been through it, and give you steps to show up better for yourself and those you love. If you're ready to forge your own path, you're in the right place. Let's get to it. The room is quiet. A tape clicks into the recorder and begins to spin. Outside, the century is turning. The Berlin Wall has fallen. The Cold War has thawed. Prosperity hums in shopping malls and cul-de-sacs. Cable news glows in living rooms and headlines promise a new era of technology and comfort. But away from the spotlight, different lives feel a different kind of heat. In a spring wind, whipping across Pennsylvania Avenue, a little girl in a wheelchair watches as men in suits drift past her without looking down. She will not roll along politely today. She unbuckles her straps, drops to the pavement, and begins to haul her body up the marble steps of the nation's house. Every inch is a question mark aimed at lawmakers who debate whether people like her should have the right to live without barriers. Across the country, a law professor pores over notes in a borrowed office. A few hours from now, she will walk into a Senate hearing room and sit under bright lights while cameras broadcast her face into millions of homes. The chairmen are skeptical. The nominee behind her glares. She hears whispers about her motives. She touches her file folder that contains the names of other women who will never testify and wonders if telling the truth is worth being disbelieved. A corporate scientist drives down a Midwestern road, his briefcase on the seat next to him. Inside are memos and formulas from a tobacco laboratory that promised him innovation and gave him silence. Years ago, he signed agreements to protect trade secrets. Now, he knows those secrets have been weaponized against the public. In a few days, he will sit across from a television journalist and describe how his former employer adjusted the chemistry of cigarettes to heighten addiction. He imagines the lawsuits, the bodyguards, the late-night phone calls that will follow. An ocean away in the mangrove swamps of the Niger Delta, an author paces in a wooden hut as soldiers patrol nearby villages. Oil rigs pump wealth out of the ground while children drink water laced with crude. For years, he has written columns, essays, and plays begging multinational companies and military leaders to acknowledge the damage and share the profits. He has organized his neighbors into a peaceful movement and has been jailed twice. He has been threatened with a third arrest, and this time the charge is murder. He knows the tribunal will be a sham. He will not flee. These are not stories of celebrities or saints. They are stories of people with ordinary beginnings who decided at one point that silence was no longer tolerable. Each act of defiance pressed them into a furnace where the value of courage would either shatter or harden. Their choices rippled outward through courtrooms, boardrooms, villages, and living rooms. Each chapter that follows is a strike of the hammer on the same glowing metal, the courage to speak truth to power. The Girl on the Steps. A cold March morning in 1990, the sidewalks around the White House fill with wheelchairs, crutches, and handmade signs. Over 1,000 disabled Americans have gathered at the start of a week of demonstrations. They wear jeans, jackets, and t-shirts embolized with the letters ADAPT, American Disabled for Accessible Public Transit. They are here because the Americans with Disabilities Act has been languishing in subcommittee debates for months. They know that the people inside the Capitol will not feel the urgency of those negotiations until they see it and hear it. The procession moves toward the Capitol. Among the marchers is 8-year-old Jennifer Keelan. She has cerebral palsy and has been protesting since she was 6 years old. Her mother pushes her wheelchair through the crowd. Jennifer is not there as a symbol to be pitied. She is there because she has already boarded buses in Phoenix to demand lifts for wheelchairs and has been arrested in Montreal while protesting inaccessible transportation. Today she is wearing a bandana around her head, jeans, and sneakers. Her energy is restless. When the marchers reach the west face of the Capitol, they encounter the iconic staircase, 83 marble steps rising between them and the door of the legislative body that claims to represent them. About 60 activists stop, remove their braces and wheelchairs, and begin to crawl up the steps on hands and knees. Jennifer looks at the adults around her. Some of them worry that a child crawling might evoke pity instead of power. Reverend Wade Blank, the founder of ADAPT, leans down and tells her quietly that if she wants to climb, she should do it. Jennifer unbuckles her seatbelt and lowers herself onto the cold stone. Her palms find the grit between the cracks. The camera flashes begin. She pulls herself up one step, then another, and another. Each movement is deliberate and painful. Her legs do not bend easily. A crowd begins to chant behind her. She does not look back. She hears reporters ask why a child is being used, and she hears older activists saying she is not being used. She is making a choice. Halfway up, sweat drips into her eyes despite the cool breeze. At the top, she collapses in her mother's arms. A photographer captures the hug. Her mother's face shows relief and pride. They are not done. The next day, more than 100 protesters, including Jennifer's mother, will be arrested in the Capitol Rotunda for demanding a meeting with the Speaker of the House. The children watch their parents being led away in handcuffs. A year earlier, when Jennifer and her sister were arrested in Canada, the police had to scramble to find accessible buses to transport them because they did not have wheelchair-accessible paddy wagons. Those ironies are not lost on her. Underneath the public spectacle is the pressure that every activist feels, the fear that their body will be used against them, the worry that the crowd will misinterpret their motives, the whispered question of whether any of this will change the law. Jennifer feels adults making decisions around her, but she also feels her own agency. She knows she is not simply being dragged along. She is participating in shaping her future. Climbing those steps is uncomfortable, and it is not safe, but comfort and safety are privileges she has never had. She climbs because she believes lawmakers should feel a fraction of the effort she expends daily to navigate a world not built for her. The moral consequence emerges days later when President George H.W. Bush signs the Americans with Disabilities Act on July 26, 1990. The ADA becomes the floor, not the ceiling. It mandates curb cuts, ramps, captioned broadcasts, and employment protections. Critics call it expensive and burdensome, but for Jennifer, the value forged on those steps is clear: a willingness to place one's body in the path of institutional indifference. Courage is not always loud. Sometimes it is measured in inches, gained on cold stone. The challenge for men hearing this story is not to imagine themselves crawling, but to ask, in what spaces have I accepted obstacles as immovable? Where have I waited for comfort instead of making discomfort visible? Courage is forged, not in speeches, but in decisions to put skin, dignity, and time on the line. When confronted with an inaccessible world, be it physical, social, or moral, do I go around quietly, or do I insist on change? Jennifer Keelan's crawl leaves no room for passive spectatorship. The question climbs alongside her. What am I willing to drag myself through to make my community more just? The law professor in the hearing room. In early October 1991, an unremarkable file folder arrives on the desk of law professor Anita Hill. Inside are typed questions from the Senate Judiciary Committee. The committee has heard rumors about inappropriate behavior by Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas toward women he supervised. They want to know whether there is anything there worth investigating. Hill, then a professor at the University of Oklahoma College of Law, has moved home from Washington years earlier and largely avoided political life. The letter forces her to remember. 10 years earlier, Hill had worked for Thomas at the U.S. Department of Education and followed him when he became chair of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. She was his legal advisor. During that time, she says he persistently asked her out, and after she refused, repeatedly engaged her in conversations about pornography and his sexual preferences. At the time, there were no high-profile cases about sexual harassment in the federal workplace. She confided in a few friends and then left. She built her career quietly and expected never to speak of those days again. Now the committee is considering a lifetime appointment for her former boss. Hill knows that if she stays silent and Thomas is confirmed, She will carry knowledge that the Senate refused to hear. If she speaks, she will be publicly cross-examined by an all-male committee, broadcast live across the nation. She has no guarantee that her testimony will prevent the confirmation. She has no promise of anonymity. She knows she will be accused of lying, revenge, and delusion. The question before her is simple but heavy. Is it worth it? Hill decides to speak, and on October 11th, she sits at a long table in the Senate caucus room. Bankers' boxes of documents, microphones, and television cameras surround her. Senators in dark suits lean forward. Thomas sits behind her at another table, arms crossed. Over 2 days, Hill repeats her allegations and endures hours of questioning. Senators ask about porn stars named Long Dong Silver and about pubic hair on a Coke can. Spectators gasp. Television audiences cringe. Hill does not raise her voice. She speaks clearly, calmly, and occasionally repeats the questions back to the senators to buy herself a moment. She refuses to smile when they joke. She declines to soften her story to spare their discomfort. At several moments, Hill could have tempered her testimony to curry favor. She could have admitted that maybe she misinterpreted Thomas's comments, or that perhaps she encouraged them. She does neither. She insists that the behavior was unprofessional and inappropriate. Senators, including Democrats, doubt her. Senator Arlen Specter suggests she has committed perjury. Senator Orrin Hatch reads from a novel, The Exorcist, to suggest she got the pubic hair story from fiction. Clarence Thomas calls the hearing a high-tech lynching, implying that Hill's allegations are part of a racist plot. Hill sits hands folded and listens. Her own government uses the language of racial solidarity to discredit her. She knows that some viewers, including some Black Americans, will see Thomas's accusation and feel torn. She does not respond. When the vote comes, Thomas is confirmed, 52 to 48, the narrowest margin in the 20th century. Hill's testimony does not stop his ascent, but it ignites something else. In the months after the hearing, phone lines at the National Women's Law Center light up with calls from women reporting workplace harassment. Claims filed with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission surge. Congress passes the Civil Rights Act of 1991, which allows victims of workplace harassment to seek damages. In the 1992 elections, a record number of women run for office and win, doubling the number of women in the House and increasing the number in the Senate. Journalists label it the Year of the Woman. For Hill, the aftermath is mixed. She receives hate mail and death threats. Law students stop her in the hallways to thank her. Strangers question her motives at the grocery store. She continues her academic work and writes books about gender and law. She testifies before other committees on workplace equality. She never recants. For 30 years, she hears her name invoked whenever another woman publicly accuses a powerful man. She is asked to comment on Harvey Weinstein, Bill Cosby, and Brett Kavanaugh. She always brings the conversation back to systems, not individuals. She insists that sexual harassment is not about sex, but about power. Men listening to Hill's story should wonder how this applies to them. Many imagine themselves as impartial judges rather than possible perpetrators. But the value being forged here, courage to speak truth to power, requires an examination of how we respond when someone brings us an uncomfortable truth. Do we listen, or do we immediately search for reasons to discredit? Are we willing to believe that our heroes may be flawed? Are we willing to face that our institutions protect? Hill's testimony reveals that courage is not just telling the truth. It is also in holding on to it when the world tells you to let go. Integrity is not confirmed by applause. It is proven when you choose clarity over camaraderie and truth over convenience. The insider who lit a cigarette. A man sits at his kitchen table in Louisville, Kentucky, reading the morning paper. The year is 1995. The headlines are full of O.J. Simpson in Bosnia. Buried deeper is a small wire story about lawsuits filed by states against tobacco companies to recoup healthcare costs. The man, Dr. Jeffrey Wigand, knows more about those suits than any journalist in America. He had been hired in 1989 as Vice President of Research and Development at Brown and Williamson Tobacco Corporation. After a career in pharmaceuticals, he was told he would help develop a safer cigarette. He thought he might work on nicotine reduction. What he found instead were directives to increase nicotine potency by adding ammonia and other chemicals. Wiggin objected. He told executives that adding coumarin, a known carcinogen, to pipe tobacco was dangerous. He asked why the company manipulated pH levels to deliver more nicotine. He refused to sign off on projects he believed harmed customers. In 1993, Brown and Williamson fired him. He signed a confidentiality agreement and went home. He found a teaching job at a local high school and tried to move on. But he watched the CEOs of the 7 major tobacco companies testify before Congress, swearing that the nicotine was not addictive. He knew those statements were false. In 1995, Wiggin began cooperating with government investigators and plaintiffs' attorneys. He gave dispositions under subpoena in lawsuits against the industry. Brown and Williamson sued him for breach of contract. They hired private detectives to dig into his past and produced a 500-page dossier to smear him. They leaked allegations about his finances and his marriage. He began receiving threatening phone calls. Security consultants advised him to check under his car for bombs and to have his mail opened by professionals. He had to carry armed protection when he taught high school chemistry. His daughters asked why men were watching their house. In the midst of this, producers from CBS's program 60 Minutes contacted him. Journalist Lowell Bergman wanted to interview Wiggin on camera. Wiggin knew that doing so would violate his confidentiality agreement and open him up to even greater legal peril. He hesitated, but he also knew that the public record needed to reflect the truth about nicotine manipulation and carcinogenic additives. In 1996, he sat in front of the camera and told Mike Wallace that Brown and Williamson had knowingly increased the addictiveness of cigarettes and suppressed research on safer alternatives. He described how the industry's internal documents contradicted its public statements. The interview was explosive. CBS initially withheld the segment under pressure from its corporate parent due to fears of litigation. The story became public anyway through a leaked deposition and a detailed article in Vanity Fair. Eventually, 60 Minutes aired the interview. Wiggin found himself at the center of one of the largest civil settlements in U.S. history. In 1997, 40 state attorneys general reached a $368 billion settlement with the tobacco industry. Brown and Williamson's lawsuit against Wiggin was dismissed as a condition of the settlement. Wiggin became a key witness in multiple lawsuits and testified before the Food and Drug Administration about nicotine addiction. He later started a nonprofit called Smoke Free Kids and worked as an expert witness and lecturer. Wiggin's courage was tested not just by corporate retaliation, but also by social perception. Some colleagues thought he was a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. Some friends distanced themselves to avoid being dragged into litigation. He lost his marriage. He suffered anxiety and depression. He gained a public platform he never wanted. Yet, he remained consistent. He did not embellish his allegations. He did not claim hero status. He simply stated facts that the public deserved to know. His story was dramatized into the film The Insider, but the movie's tension could not capture the quiet dread of checking his car engine every morning or the small relief of seeing his students learn chemistry under the watch of bodyguards. For men listening, Wiggin's story challenges a common rationalization that loyalty to an employer or a paycheck absolves you from responsibility when you witness wrongdoing. Wiggin once believed that his silence protected his family and his career. He later learned that the cost of silence was complicity, the act of breaking a non-disclosure agreement, of testifying under subpoena, of appearing on national television was not a performance. It was a recognition that integrity demands accountability, even when the law and your industry conspire to keep. Courage here is not about spontaneous rebellion. It is about methodical decision-making, documenting, cooperating, seeking legal counsel, understanding the risks, and then proceeding anyway when the moral stakes outweigh the personal. Now we move on to the writer who would not bow. The Niger Delta in the early 1990s is lush, humid, and pulsing with oil rigs. Since 1958, multinational corporations have extracted tens of billions of dollars of oil from the region. The Ogoni people, a community of about 550,000 farmers and fishers, see little of this wealth. What they see are pipelines cutting through their farms, flares lighting up their nights, and oil spills turning rivers black. Gas flares roar near homes, day and night, spraying soot onto crops. Fish vanish. Children develop skin rashes. Jobs promised by the oil companies go instead to outsiders. Complaints to the Nigerian government and to the Royal Dutch Shell are ignored. Ken Saro-Wiwa is a writer, satirist, and television producer. He has served as a regional commissioner in Nigeria's civil war. By the early 1990s, he is the president of the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People, the MOSOP, an organization that demands environmental remediation, compensation, and political autonomy for Ogoniland. In January 1993, he organizes a peaceful march of some 300,000 Ogoni through the Niger Delta. It is one of the largest demonstrations against environmental degradation on the African continent. The protest is nonviolent but defiant. MOSOP petitions the oil companies to clean up spills, stop gas flaring, and share royalties with the local community. They ask the Nigerian government for political representation and self-determination. Saro-Wiwa writes columns and gives speeches around the world. He wins the Right Livelihood Award and is nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. The government responds with force. Soldiers raid Ogoni villages, beating and arresting activists. Shell requests more security and provides monetary and logistical support to the Nigerian police. In 1994, 4 Ogoni chiefs aligned with the government are murdered in a conflict unrelated to MOSOP. The military regime seizes on the murders as a pretext to dismantle the movement. Soldiers storm Saro-Wiwa's home in May 1994 and arrest him along with several MOSOP leaders. They are held for months without charge and tortured. International observers condemn the detention. Amnesty International names Saro-Wiwa a prisoner of conscience. In October 1995, a military tribunal convened by General Sani Abacha tries Saro-Wiwa and 8 others for the murders. The trial is widely criticized as fraudulent. Defense lawyers are denied access to witnesses. Judges are handpicked from the military. The defendants are not allowed to appeal. Evidence linking them to the crimes is thin. Witnesses later recant testimonies, saying they were bribed, yet the tribunal convicts all 9. International leaders, including the U.S. President Bill Clinton, appeal for clemency. Shell issues statements denying involvement. The Nigerian government ignores the pleas. On November 10, 1995, Saro-Wiwa and his colleagues are hanged. It reportedly takes 5 attempts to execute him. News spread around the world. Governments recall ambassadors. Nigeria is suspended from the Commonwealth of Nations. Protests erupt in London, New York, and Lagos. Within Ogoniland, a heavy silence descends. Saro-Wiwa's last words to his attorney, recorded in a smuggled note, are, "Lord, take my soul, but the struggle continues." The consequences of his execution are complex. Shell eventually settles a lawsuit brought by the families of the Ogoni 9 for $15.5 million in 2009 without admitting liability. The Niger Delta remains polluted and militarized. MOSOP splinters. Some activists go underground, yet Saro-Wiwa's writings continue to circulate. His son, Ken Wiwa, and his brother, Owens Wiwa, continue advocacy. Environmental justice movements across the world cite Ogoni as an example of resource extraction's human cost. The case is taught in law schools as a lesson in corporate accountability and human rights. For men listening, Ken Saro-Wiwa's story tests a different facet of courage. He was not facing a personal employer or a workplace, but a military state entwined within global corporations. He was offered opportunities to leave Nigeria. He chose to stay. He was told he could quiet his rhetoric in exchange for safety. He refused. His courage is not just in opposing the state, but in maintaining nonviolent discipline among a frustrated population. He insisted that the movement's legitimacy depended on its adherence to peaceful methods, even when provoked. That choice cost him his life. Where do men compromise to avoid conflict? In what situations do we accept environmental or social degradation because it is convenient? Sarawiwa's life raises uncomfortable questions about consumption and complicity. When we fill our gas tanks, do we think about where that fuel comes from? When we invest in companies, do we consider the externalities they impose on distant communities? Courage sometimes requires seeing beyond our immediate environment and recognizing the structures that support our comfort. It may mean speaking up in board meetings, challenging family members, or rethinking careers. It may mean that the audience you most need to address is thousands of miles away. Ken Saro-Wiwa reminds us that integrity is global and that the cost of silence can be measured not just in personal comfort, but in poisoned rivers and lost lives. Now we talk about The Whisper That Carried. Houston, August 1992. The Republican National Convention convenes inside the Astrodome, decorated with red, white, and blue bunting. Delegates cheer for speeches about economic growth and family values. Television cameras scan the crowd. On the third night, shortly before prime time, a 44-year-old artist and mother named Mary Fisher walks onto the stage in a cream-colored suit. She grips the podium and looks out over the faces of the party she has served for years. Few in the arena know that she has been living with HIV since 1991. Even fewer expect to hear her disclose it. She takes a breath and begins, her voice measured and clear. Tonight, I represent an AIDS community whose members have been treated like pariahs, she says, explaining that she came to bring their silence to an end. The pressure bearing down on Fisher is layered. She is the daughter of a wealthy Republican fundraiser and has worked as a volunteer in the White House. Her social circle is conservative. When her marriage ended and she discovered her husband had infected her with HIV, she retreated to her home in Colorado and considered telling no one beyond her doctor and family. At the time, AIDS is widely associated with gay men and intravenous drug use. Mothers in suburbs fear letting their children share drinking fountains. Fisher knows that many in her party view HIV as a moral failing. By walking onto that platform, she risks social ostracism, political exile, and a more immediate fear that other parents will bar their children from playing with her sons. She addresses the delegates not as an angry outsider, but as a loyal insider. She reminds them that more than 200,000 Americans have already died and that 1 million are living with the virus. She warns that tens of millions worldwide may die regardless of good intentions if stigma persists. She refuses to let the virus be framed as a partisan issue. The AIDS virus is not a political creature, she tells them. It does not ask whether you are Democrat or Republican, whether you are white or black, male or female, gay or straight. She announces that she stands with a black infant in Africa and a lonely gay man in an American city, even though she is a white woman who was infected in marriage. Her hands stay on the podium. She does not pound her fist. She does not raise her voice. Around her, the stadium that had minutes before erupted with chants falls still. Some delegates shift in their seats. Others wipe their eyes. Fisher knows that she has their attention, but she also knows that attention is not the same as action. She recounts how ignorance and prejudice kill. She quotes the German theologian Martin Niemöller, who described watching the Nazis arrest various minorities while he said nothing until there was no one left to speak up. She warns that AIDS will leave her sons as orphans. She calls on her party to lift the shroud of silence and to respond with compassion instead of fear. When she finishes, the delegates raise in their standing ovation, but the legislative platform adopted that week contains only limited acknowledgement of AIDS. Fisher steps away from the podium, knowing that applause does not guarantee policy. What proves the sincerity of her words is what follows. Fisher refuses to fade into private life. She founds the Mary Fisher Care Fund and uses her artistic talents to raise money for HIV research and education. She travels to Africa to work with women living with HIV, teaching them quilting and needlework as income sources and listening to their stories. She becomes an ambassador for the joint United Nations program on HIV/AIDS, using her platform to argue that compassion must cross borders. She writes books about living with the virus and speaks in churches, universities, and corporate boardrooms. She acknowledges her privilege. She is white, wealthy, and connected, but insists that privilege should not be used to amplify, not to shield. Her activism helps shift public perception of AIDS from a narrow stigma toward a broader understanding of human vulnerability. Her 1992 speech is later ranked among the most significant speeches of the 20th century. For men listening, Fisher's quiet courage prompts uncomfortable questions about how we can use our own platforms. Many of us move in environments where maintaining status, employment, or community standing can feel more important than disrupting harmful silence. We tell ourselves that issues like addiction, disease, or injustice are someone else's problem. We may think that because we are not directly affected, we are safe. Fisher reminds us that complacency is a luxury. She stood in front of her political allies and told them that their policies and rhetoric mattered to people like her and to the countless others who could not stand there. She did not lecture or scold. She testified. She used her privilege not to escape, but to expose. When you have the ear of people who can shape policy, do you use it? When you sit at a table where a harmful joke is told or a damaging decision is made, do you risk your comfort to speak? Courage is not always defying an enemy. Sometimes it is about challenging friends. Fisher's story also raises the tension between individual action and collective change. Her speech did not immediately transform her party's platform, but it did create a ripple in public consciousness. Decades later, antiretroviral drugs prolong millions of lives, and HIV stigma has lessened in many places. Those changes were not solely due to one speech, but her willingness to break silence contributed. In your own spheres, what are you leaving unsaid because you assume others will handle it? If you have a platform, whether in your family, workplace, church, or online, how might you use it to bring a hidden issue into light? The answer is not to become a public speaker. It is to recognize that silence is a choice with consequences. Mary Fisher's whisper carried because she aligned it with truth, compassion, and persistence. What will you do? Hammered steel and unbroken lines. The lives we have explored in this episode do not share geography, profession, or upbringing. An 8-year-old crawling up marble steps, a law professor submitting testimony under oath, a scientist breaching a confidentiality agreement, a writer facing a firing squad, and a mother revealing her illness on a convention stage. What binds them is not fame, but the choice to tell a truth that those in power would have preferred remained hidden. Each one stepped from the margins into the center and spoke words that could not be unsaid. This is the work of forging values under pressure. Courage is not a word to tattoo on the wall. It is the willingness to absorb risk, physical, social, or economic, for the sake of integrity. It is the decision to use your body, your mind, your evidence, your art to disrupt silence. It is the recognition that even when you do not win the immediate battle, you leave a mark for others to follow. As you turn off this episode and return to your life, consider what silence you have been keeping. Ask yourself what truths in your community, workplace, or family remain unspoken because it is easier to let them lie. None of us are exempt from the responsibility to speak when lives and dignity are at stake. You do not need to be 8 years old or standing before cameras. You need only decide that your comfort is not worth more than someone else's suffering. If these stories moved you, share them. Talk about them with a friend. Let them unsettle the places where you have chosen ease over truth. Subscribe or follow this podcast to ensure you do not miss the next episode. Leave a review so that other men who might need these stories can find them. Support the work if you are able, because producing these narratives requires time, research, and care. Most of all, carry the value forged here into meetings, kitchens, classrooms, and sidewalks where your life unfolds. The hammering does not end with the last word. It begins anew each day when you choose to act. You are not broken. You are not behind. You are a man in progress. Follow for more.